Well, I've read some Rumi, particularly. It's great poetry. It's moving. It inspires thought. I think that's, over the centuries, a matter of exploring our internal moral nature and gaining clarification of the principles that should guide a good and decent life. The moral arc of the universe tends towards progress and righteousness, slowly, with plenty of regression. But it's a matter of more deeply exploring our. So if I read an article about science, exploring the mysteries of the universe, that's an aesthetic experience as well. Profound tragedies of human suffering in many parts of the world. All of these arouse emotions, strong feelings. It's been noticed for a long time that one of the earliest things an infant learns is things like, "That's not fair." But very young children have already understood it in a quite deep sense, as you can see by their choices and behavior. So where's it coming from? Something about their inner nature. If we look at the past, we see our own history has changed radically in how we conceive of these notions, but there's still a basic fundamental uniformity. We can discover what that is. The more we learn about it, it'll be our intrinsic nature, our intrinsic moral nature. We can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds, and we can select among them to pursue them, discarding many others. And we can even convey to others who have no access to our minds the innermost workings of our minds. They regarded this as one of the great mysteries of the universe. I agree with that. You're puzzling over a problem, you agonize over it, work on it. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes some simple idea, and you say, how come I was so stupid I didn't see that? It unravels the whole problem. We all have puzzles, dilemmas, perplexities. We worry about them, concerned with them. Sometimes, out of nowhere, a solution appears, unravels the problems, we learn how to proceed. It's a common experience everywhere, from every person in their ordinary lives to Albert Einstein and people probing the extreme mysteries of the universe. The modern state system is a very recent development in human history. There was no state system. The state system in the Middle East region was imposed by European colonialism, drawing borders which were beneficial to the needs of Britain and France. He says, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and you have not. That's how Europe conquered the world. More savagery, more violence, more organized violence developed out of Europe's very ugly internal history. You do not have in many societies, fortunately, any longer marriage contracts that consign women to virtual slavery. That was true even in the West until recently. It may surprise you to hear it, but it wasn't until 1975, not that long ago. Actually, your region of the world is one that's suffering the most. It's heating up much more rapidly than the rest of the world. It seems that there was sharp decline in quality of life as modern capitalism developed. On the other hand, it developed the wealth, complexity, richness of society that we now see that you and I are now enjoying. That's happened in much of the world. When Europeans began to conquer other parts of the world, they destroyed the commons. They imposed the principle that it's only property if you own it. Well, that's led to the development of advanced industrial capitalism with things like the achievements you and I are now using. On the other hand, it's destroyed people's lives. All of the achievements in history, everything that we've described, overcoming chattel slavery, rights of women, you name it. It's come from below, from popular struggle. No great leader brought it about. Same with everything else. You want to wait for a great leader, you wait forever. You want to organize people to struggle for their rights, become informed, get together, develop more just social forms for themselves, overcome authoritarian structures, then you can have progress.
This is our second interview with Professor Noam Chomsky. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, and we're excited to gain from your knowledge and insights. I have questions about human nature, modern state, anarchy model, politics, and ethics. So thank you in the beginning.
Thank you.
As a philosopher and a well-known thinker, how do you analyze the need of religion, the need to religion? We notice that humans from the beginning of history lived with great philosophies, religions, metaphysical doctrines. They couldn't explain the major questions such as death, fate, evil, cause of creation easily. Thus, they were thirsty for deep meaning through connection to spiritual, Sufi, metaphysical, and religious schools of thought.
Well, people, as you say, people ask for some explanation of what's happening. Children want to know why this is happening, not other things. People are concerned with what are the heavenly bodies? Why do people die? What happens after they die? How were they created? All kinds of questions. Over time, many of these questions have been shifted to a domain where you can find, where there are methods for finding certain kinds of answers. We call that science. The shift from general speculations and beliefs to science is not a sharp boundary. It's steps that are taken, and as they're taken, you have a greater domain for inquiry in which you can receive substantial, testable answers which have verifiable conclusions, and that there's many other domains which are where there's curiosity, uncertainty, and we sometimes call this religion. Most societies don't have what they call religion. That's a Western the concept that developed in the so-called section of what we now call the civilized world. Grew up around Mesopotamia, Egypt, spread over much of the rest of the world, and that developed science, and it separated from the set of beliefs that we call religion. So if you look back at the Greeks, it's in between.
So even ways of thinking, presenting ideas developed. So it's a great and a wide human heritage. Maybe you're aware of the rapid growth of Sufi studies in the West, all the translations of Persian poetry like Rumi, Attar, where people find great wisdom, virtues, which is presented in an extraordinary, interesting forms. So there's a great heritage that should be taken into account for you as a philosopher and a great thinker.
Well, I've read some Rumi, particularly. It's great poetry. It's moving. It inspires thought. To me, it has wisdom, but it's not something that I really know enough about to talk about in any depth.
I mean, it has deep analysis of the human psychology and how one can enhance his ethical and virtuous side. And as a philosopher who studies the human nature, he may find such knowledge interesting.
How can one enhance ethical and virtuous side? We can do it in our lives regularly. We're constantly facing ethical problems of all kinds. We can think about them, ask questions about what are better ways and worse ways, what are assumptions about how we deal with humans, with animals, with nature, question more deeply whether our standardist beliefs are actually adequate to yielding a good, virtuous life. And over the centuries, you can see an expansion of ethical vision. So things that were considered perfectly legitimate not many years ago are now regarded as unspeakable. And I think that's, over the centuries, a matter of exploring our internal moral nature and gaining clarification of the principles that should guide a good and decent life. There's plenty of regression. Doesn't just go forward. But over a long period of time, I think we can say that there is, use the familiar phrase, the moral arc of the universe tends towards progress and righteousness, slowly, with plenty of regression. But it's a matter of more deeply exploring our inner nature and discerning what we fundamentally recognize to be right and wrong. But that's just a daily preoccupation. We do it all the time. I'm sure, as soon as we stop talking, we'll run into questions of this kind, because they're all in every aspect of life.
So, Professor, great arts and music were developed in the context of religions, religious scholars and texts. So how can a thinker keep all this heritage apart through his engagement with linguistics, political philosophy, and human nature?
I don't see it as a problem. I can enjoy the cathedral in Chartres, the great paintings of religious artists for what they mean to me, understanding the context in which they developed. I have a different context, a study of language, political philosophy, human nature is indistinguishable from these efforts to explore the thought, understanding, belief of societies that are different from ours, but are actually the origin of our own thinking and perception and understanding. So don't really see any kind of conflict, just ways of enriching one's experience and understanding. So if I read an article about science, exploring the mysteries of the universe, that's an aesthetic experience as well, different kind.
So, Professor, you seem always involved with concepts, thoughts, ideas. What's the role of emotions in your personal life? Which kind of emotions and feelings you live through your days and weeks, maybe feeling sympathy or empathy towards certain people as you follow news or anything else?
Hard to know. Feelings of sympathy extend from my family, the precious animals that are sleeping at my feet right now. I don't want to use the name or they'll run to the door, to deep personal engagement with the profound tragedies of human suffering in many parts of the world. All of these arouse emotions, strong feelings, deep wish that it's possible to do something about it. I don't know how anybody can survive without this array of complex emotional reactions to things nearby, far away. Even thinking about the future causes great emotion. To think that my great-grandchildren will live in a world that may be collapsing and almost uninhabitable, that causes enormous emotions.
So what makes you laugh too much, or what makes you really cry?
Cry ranges from personal matters. At my age, I've been present at the death of people I loved greatly. My first wife, close friends. It's what happens when you get to my age. All the way to societies, to people I've never met, but whose suffering and misery I can easily empathize with. What makes me laugh? All kinds of things. Funny things that happen in ordinary life, comic artists, many things.
So, Professor, going to the humankind question. So, what's your theory in the original human nature, and what type of relation it has to ethics and values? Is there a mental ability in humans' nature to discover virtues and vices and to distinguish between good and bad from an ethical point of view?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that we have a fundamental ethical and moral nature. We attribute responsibility to others in a way that my dogs don't. And we don't regard them as having responsibilities. If I have a small dog who, if she sees a baby chick that fell out of the nest, she'll eat it. I don't blame her for that. I don't say she's being immoral, because the concept of morality just doesn't apply. Humans are different. For us, these concepts apply because we have a different nature. I don't think there's any other organism that has anything like a fundamental nature that determines a form of good and evil, of moral responsibility, of obligation, and so on, unknown in other organisms. Something unique to us, just as language, reflection, reason, and so on are unique to us. There are little tiny bits and pieces of it elsewhere, but nothing remotely like what exists in the human organism. Only in recent years, it's become a matter of scientific inquiry, not just speculation. So there's the beginnings of studies of children before they're socialized into the culture, see what their basic concepts are. It's been noticed for a long time that one of the earliest things an infant learns is things like, "That's not fair." Well, that's a pretty complicated concept when you think about it. Try to explicate it. But very young children have already understood it in a quite deep sense, as you can see by their choices and behavior. So where's it coming from? Something about their inner nature. There have also been studies in recent decades of comparative analysis of concepts in different societies. And there's quite overwhelming uniformity, not total. And even not, if we look at the past, we see our own history has changed radically in how we conceive of these notions, but there's still a basic fundamental uniformity. We can discover what that is. The more we learn about it, it'll be our intrinsic nature, our intrinsic moral nature. Then there arise other questions which are beginning to be asked. How do we know our intrinsic moral nature, whatever it is the real good and evil? Well, it's not an easy question. Actually, similar questions arise even in scientific inquiry. So we have certain approaches to trying to understand the world. That's our basic innate epistemology, as David Hume and others have pointed out. It's just part of our animal nature. There are certain ways of inquiring which we pursue, not others. How do we know these are the right ones? These are basically unanswerable questions because there's no concept of the right one other than those that emerge from our own fundamental nature. So here we're at the verge of questions that you can formulate, but you can't really answer.
So do you believe that the real innate essence of people is good, so they will tend to do good things and behave in a good manner and do good deeds? And
anything that humans do is an aspect of human nature by definition. If we look over history, we look over our own experience, we see mixtures of what we regard as good and evil. We look elsewhere or even back in our own history or our own personal lives, we see that what we regarded as good at one point is really evil. So are people inherently good? Yes, they have that capacity. Are they inherently evil? Yes, they have that capacity. Which ones, which aspects of their basic moral constitution, which aspects emerge, is very much a matter of circumstances, social institutions, acculturation, and so on. And that's why civilized people believe in the possibility of rehabilitation. A person is not innately evil or good. All kinds of possibilities in life. You can rehabilitate people in principle, sometimes actually, to overcome what they've done. Like I have long correspondences with people on death row who admit that what they did was wrong. They admit the crimes, but they're trying to make something of their lives in the last brief period that's open to them. That's understandable.
Professor, so I'll ask you this question. Is there an idea or a theory that you discovered which kept you in a state of wonder or perplexity or was very astonishing for you, whether in linguistics or philosophy or human mind?
Well, I have wonder and perplexity about what you and I are now doing. How are we able to do this? How is it possible for you to come up with new thoughts, questions, formulate them? How is it possible for me to think about them, give some kind of response, no doubt inadequate. You come back and tell me how to improve it. How can we do any of this? Nobody knows. In fact, at the origins of the modern scientific revolution, Galileo, his contemporaries, were asking serious questions about the nature of the world. They were puzzled by things that seemed obvious to their predecessors. That's what began modern science, this sense of puzzlement. And one of the things they were puzzled about was just what we're talking about. Galileo, his contemporaries, expressed their awe and amazement about what they regarded as a miraculous fact. With a finite number of symbols, we can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds, and we can select among them to pursue them, discarding many others. And we can even convey to others who have no access to our minds the innermost workings of our minds. They regarded this as one of the great mysteries of the universe. I agree with that. That's why I think the inquiry into the nature of language and mind is penetrating into the most fundamental elements, not just of our nature, but of the way the world functions.
Professor, have you discovered an important theory throughout your life, but not from thinking, but rather from a special grace or a thought that just jumped into your mind, it wasn't caused from reading and thinking and dealing with concepts?
Happens all the time. In science, of course. You're puzzling over a problem, you agonize over it, work on it. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes some simple idea, and you say, how come I was so stupid I didn't see that? It unravels the whole problem. But it happens to everybody in ordinary life, too. We all have puzzles, dilemmas, perplexities. We worry about them, concerned with them. Sometimes, out of nowhere, a solution appears, unravels the problems, we learn how to proceed. It's a common experience everywhere, from every person in their ordinary lives to Albert Einstein and people probing the extreme mysteries of the universe. Common experience. Nobody understands anything about it, nothing.
I'll go to my second topic, Professor. So do you believe that the structure of states throughout history, reaching to the modern state, helped in transforming people and societies into a more egoistic beings and increased greediness? And why is that?
The modern state system is a very recent development in human history. Take, say, the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. There weren't any states. You could travel from Cairo to Baghdad to Istanbul without crossing a border, without a passport. If you went to Beirut, you go to the Greek community, they're dealing with their own affairs in their own way. You go to the Shiite community, same thing, they're taking care of it. They interacted in various manners. There was no state system. The state system in the Middle East region was imposed by European colonialism, drawing borders which were beneficial to the needs of Britain and France. Totally arbitrary borders, as you know better than I do, breaks people apart who are very close, brings people together who have nothing to do with each other. It's true of every one of the modern states. Many people just don't observe the state borders. So take Afghanistan and Pakistan. The British drew a line, Durand Line. The local people Doesn't make any sense to them. Their brothers, their cousins are on the other side of the line. On their side of the line are people they can't talk to, speak a different language, and have a different culture. It's true all through the region. What about Europe? Same story. The borders of European states were established by violence. Many of them have no meaning. You go back 100 years, it was much more fluid. You went from Paris to Rome. You passed through. There happened to be something called a border. But if you look at the languages, cultures, associations, they just change slowly in a complex, mixed variety. In fact, in places like Italy, state formation really hasn't even been completed. There are plenty of people in Italy who can't talk to their grandmothers because they come from a different culture, speak a different language. In fact, go back in France, go back a century, it was the same thing. Take, say, the United States, which is a very homogeneous society, not by its nature, by violence. The indigenous populations were wiped out. The settlers came from originally mostly parts of England, Scotch-Irish, so it's homogeneous. But you can still go to parts of the United States. I visited them. Eastern Kentucky, Appalachia. You walk in the streets, you can't understand what people are saying. They speak a different language. Go to lecture at the university, as I've done. They have courses in which they teach students English, meaning standard English, so that they can get a job at IBM. They can't in the local dialect. Well, that's what most of the world has been like throughout all of history. The state system has been imposed in recent times in violent, brutal ways, and it has many consequences, many of them very harmful. Europe is again striking case because that's where the state system in its modern form developed recently, but still earlier than other places. Europe's had a violent, savage, brutal history. Part of the reason why Europe was able to conquer the world was because European savagery had turned war into a kind of science, so they were more advanced. There's a famous little ditty that you've probably heard. It goes back to Hilaire Belloc about European imperialism. He says, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and you have not." That's how Europe conquered the world. More savagery, more violence, more organized violence developed out of Europe's very ugly internal history. Well, just to show what human nature is like, in the first half of this century, it reached a peak of horror and destruction that had previously been unimaginable. Finally, in 1945, settled down. Now, countries that spent hundreds of years slaughtering one another have friendly relations. France and Germany, for hundreds of years, their highest goal was to slaughter each other. 30 years war in the 17th century, probably a third of the population of Germany was wiped out. And it went on. I don't have to talk about the 20th century. Well, late 20th century, early 21st century, they're on friendly terms. Cross the border without a passport, study in one country or another, take a job in one country or another. Languages may differ, but they tend to know each other's languages. Okay. That shows the range and capacities of our mysterious, complex internal nature.
Very interesting. So, Professor, state systems in the history of humanity and in the modern days increased evil, corruption, and oppression in general, or it also, on the other hand, played a role in controlling, organizing, and preventing evil and corruption?
Both, just like human nature. Take the 20th century. First half of the 20th century in Europe, worst crimes in history. Second half of the 20th century in Europe, pretty much peace. Russian invasion of Ukraine is the first. There have been other wars in Europe, like the NATO attack on Serbia, but it's nothing like the first half of the 20th century. As I said, countries that had been at war, murderous, savage war for centuries, now have perfectly friendly relations. States don't act as independent entities. They reflect attitudes, power structures, relationships inside the state. They changed. They changed dramatically. That should be able to happen elsewhere. My own feeling is that in the Middle East region, the best solution would be to go back to something like the Ottoman Empire, without its corruption, brutality, savagery, authoritarianism, but with the basic structure that I described. I'll just tell you a personal anecdote. About 75 years ago, I was living in a kibbutz in Israel. I was, like other young people, I was hiking out with a backpack, walking around up in the northern Galilee. At one point, the road behind me, a Jeep drove by, a man got out and started yelling at me in Hebrew, saying, "Come back." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "You're in the wrong country." I had walked into Lebanon. The borders an armed camp, but at that time, there was nothing. There's no difference between the northern Galilee and Israel and Lebanon. They're the same. Well, the British drew a border. Later developments have led to vicious and brutal hostility and massacre. Doesn't have to be like that. You can go back to the days before there was a border. And that's true just about everywhere in the world you look.
Great, and I'll ask you more about the Middle East. But to continue, so modernity, capitalism with its medicine and health system, poverty, global warming, wars and conflicts is killing and destroying people's lives and well-beings more, or on the other hand, modernity is also serving and securing humanity more. So in comparing, what can you say here?
All sorts of things. Modernity has partly eliminated chattel slavery. There still are about 40 or 50 million people in the world who live in basically slave conditions, including many women who are bound by marriage contracts to virtual slavery. So slavery hasn't been eliminated, but chattel slavery has been eliminated. You don't have cotton fields in the south of the United States where slaves are being tortured, brutalized, working in tolerable positions, separated from their families, totally subservient to the war, to the rule of a cruel master. Well, it's kind of modernity. Where did that start? Actually, it started with slaves in Africa. African slaves began to organize, appeal to the Vatican, which was then the supreme arbiter of rules and orders. African slaves appealed to the Vatican, 16th century, 17th century, urging the Vatican to pass laws and principles that would bar the worst forms of slavery. At that point, Portuguese slavery in Africa mainly. Well, there was some response, by no means perfect, but some response to mitigate the horrors of slavery. Over time, other abolitionist movements developed. Finally, slavery was abolished, formal slavery, not without violence, not without a residue, still has a residue today, but that's one aspect of modernity. Same with women's rights. You do not have in many societies, fortunately, any longer marriage contracts that consign women to virtual slavery. That was true even in the West until recently. May surprise you to hear it, but it wasn't until 1975, not that long ago, that the U.S. Supreme Court determined that women are peers, the equivalent of men, like they have a right to serve on federal juries. They're not property. 1975. Other societies, some societies were ahead of us, others behind. Well, that's modernity. Another aspect of modernity is what you described. We're destroying the environment that sustains life. Humans aren't going to be around much longer if we continue on our current path. We have a couple of decades in which we can mitigate, perhaps overcome, the grim effects of heating the environment. We don't take that, it'll be finished. It's not that everybody dies tomorrow. It's just that the world will pass irreversible tipping points, after which there's no hope. Actually, your region of the world is one that's suffering the most. It's heating up much more rapidly than the rest of the world. The Eastern Mediterranean is expected to, under current trends, expected by the end of the century to have a rise in heat of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, essentially unlivable. Sea level rise in the Eastern Mediterranean of maybe 2 to 2.5 meters. Just look at the settlements around the Eastern Mediterranean. It's an indescribable catastrophe. You go to Central Africa, droughts, unlivability, huge numbers of people migrating because they can't survive. All of South India people living in mud huts in India are trying to survive the heat of almost 50 degrees Celsius without air conditioners, of course. Maybe 10% of the population even has air conditioners, not poor peasants in Rajasthan. All of that's going to get much worse. That's the future we're facing. So that's another aspect of modernity. Can we control that the way savage war was controlled in Europe, the way chattel slavery was overcome? That's for your generation to answer. My generation's failed. Maybe your generation can answer it.
Very interesting. Professor, you talk about monarchy systems. So do you agree and fight that humanity should get rid of this current modern state structure and overcome it? Do you believe that this is necessary?
The state system served a function which was in part positive, but it has very dangerous aspects. I think we're much better off if the state system declines, if borders erode. Take Europe again. Europe is much healthier with the erosion of the borders that separated the states into warring, savage, mutually destructive entities. I think the same would be true in the Middle East. Same would be true where I live. I happen to live in Arizona. Arizona was conquered from Mexico in a brutal, savage war, which took half of Mexico and turned it into Arizona, California, parts of the United States. Almost half the population in the city where I live is Mexican. They go to visit their cousins and relatives across the border, which is a very difficult procedure. You have to go through border checks, hostile border guards, and so on. Why shouldn't they be able to live, just take a drive and visit their cousin or their mother or whoever, you know?
And as an important figure representing this theory of anarchism, so how did social life operated before the state system? So if you go 1,000 years ago or even more, was it a forest or people managed in a way or another to organize and control themselves and impose a certain system?
You see it still in indigenous societies. They survive, they live in harmony with nature, they have happy lives. In fact, if you look over history, this is a difficult topic. It's contentious. We don't know the facts in detail. But the evidence available to us now indicates that with the rise of capitalism in Europe, in the modern capitalism, which became with wage labor, ownership of workers, and so on, modern capitalism, when that developed, standard of living for most people declined. If you look at measures like height, longevity, health of teeth, the things you can look at, seems that there was sharp decline in quality of life as modern capitalism developed. Apparently, it wasn't until mid-19th century that in Europe, most people recovered the basic quality of life that they had in the pre-capitalist period. In the rest of the world, it's much slower. That's one aspect of capitalism. On the other hand, it developed the wealth, complexity, richness of society that we now see, that you and I are now enjoying. So life is not a simple matter. But how do people organize themselves? Through the commons. Take, say, England, the progenitor of modern capitalism. Modern capitalism began in England when people were forcefully driven off the commons. It's what's called enclosure. Powerful people, lords, were able to gain the power of the state to enclose areas that had been common property. What was called the commons. The commons meant a place where you could graze your cattle. A widow could go and pick things that she needed to survive. People took care of the commons. They retained it. It's like indigenous tribes today in their own nature. They nurtured it, kept it alive. It was available to everyone. Enclosures ended that, turned it into private property. That's happened in much of the world when Europeans began to conquer other parts of the world. They destroyed the commons. They imposed the principle that it's only property if you own it. And people who don't own property don't have any right to it. So indigenous people, of course, the commons, nobody owned. It's everybody's property. We take care of it together. So they were driven, you know what happened. I don't have to describe it to you. Imposed a system of brutal, vicious colonization, murdered endless numbers of people, led to hideous outcomes. The world is very far from having overcome these monstrosities, but a lot of it was based on the idea that it's not property unless you own it. And that means somebody else doesn't own it. You take it away from them. Well, that's led to the development of advanced industrial capitalism with things like the achievements you and I are now using. On the other hand, it's destroyed people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So, Professor, in this context, there were several unique governing experiences, which are types of anarchy, and you talk about them like Barcelona communes during Civil War or Paris communes. So, were these systems successful to a certain extent? And there is a governing model that in history that you admire?
Well, the Spanish anarchists in the 1936, including Barcelona, but it went far beyond into the agricultural areas. These were achievements that I became very much interested in childhood. Young teenager, I was reading about them, meeting people who fled from Spain, anarchists during the Franco-fascist takeover of Spain. It's a mixed story, but they were quite successful in developing a highly libertarian society, not without flaws, but great success, particularly when you consider the circumstances. They were destroyed by violence, led incidentally by the communists. Communist Party was the party of the police, the petty bourgeois. It was the core of the republic. They wanted to fight the war against Franco, didn't want this libertarian revolution in the background. So they basically wiped it out, along with the fascists and the liberal democracies. They fought among each other, but they all agreed in eliminating the libertarian anarchist developments. Paris Commune, also destroyed by force. There are somewhat similar developments today. One of them is in Syria, Rojava, the Kurdish areas in Syria managed in the midst of a horrendous, violent, destructive war, managed to carve out an area where they have developed amazingly a collaborative libertarian society, rights for women, rights for others, common property, common decision-making. Can they survive with Turkey trying to destroy them, the Assad regime trying to destroy them, no support from the outside? It's not going to be easy. Something similar happening in southern Mexico, Chiapas, indigenous areas, also developing along these lines. There's bits and pieces of it everywhere, even in the advanced industrial countries like the United States. You take a look at the old, what's called Rust Belt, place which used to be the main industrial center in the United States. It's now deindustrialized. Corporations have realized they can make greater profit by exploiting cheap labor with no labor regulations, no environmental constraints in Mexico, China, Vietnam, and so on. So they shift production there. But working people haven't just given up. A lot of them are forming worker-owned, worker management cooperatives, which work their way into the developing service economy. Those are germs of a more free and just future. Can this ever reach the point of major social change without destruction from violent forces? We don't know. You go back in history, nobody could predict that feudalism would ever end.
So, Professor, in this context, what do you think of Aristotle's theory, the philosopher, the wise king, which will ensure justice and a virtuous life for the society? Otherwise, we'll have rulers, presidents, and leaders who will impose conflicts and wars and corruption and oppression.
I think those are some of the most horrible ideas that were ever developed. In fact, when you read the details, it's shocking. So it's basically Plato, Aristotle, not so much. But if you read the Platonic dialogues and you listen to Socrates, the greatest wise man, outlining what the perfect society would be, it's hair-raising. Perfect society would be one in which most of the people get no education because their task is just to perform particular activities. A craftsman who works on leather, learns how to work on leather, that's his whole life, doesn't have to know anything else. No teaching, no education, never get out of it. The slaves, of course, are just slaves. They don't get anything. Women don't get anything. They're just off on the side somewhere. You get to the army, they have to have some education because they have to go to war. Socrates himself was a military man. They had to fight in the wars, so they needed some training and some education. Then you have the philosophers, the wise men. What do? Well, read the Platonic dialogues, Symposium and others. The wise men gather in the evening at the luxurious home of some very rich man. They have slaves who bring them things to drink and to eat. They wait for the arrival of Socrates, the super wise man. He comes in. They debate and discuss while they're being served drinks, getting drunk, and so on. That's the philosophy. That's the model of how society should be run by Socrates, Plato, in other words. You like that? I don't. In fact, it's kind of interesting that if you go to the slave societies of the South in the United States, the worst, most hideous form of slavery in human history, but there were cultivated, educated people who admired it, supported it. John Calhoun, the head of the Confederacy, highly educated, very sophisticated gentleman. Thomas Jefferson would have been glad to have dinner with him in Monticello. He argued that you have to have slavery, otherwise you can't have high culture. We certainly want high culture and education. How can you have that without slavery? And he used as his model classical Greece, which was what, as I described.
But some thinkers would say that your ideas are also utopian and dreams in a way or another.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's been true throughout history. You go back 400 years ago, there were people who had the utopian idea that you didn't have to have slaves working under brutal, cruel masters who would torture them. That was considered utopian. Well, fortunately, there were people who had these utopian ideas. More recently, there were women who had the utopian idea that they didn't have to be servants and slaves, that they weren't just the property of their father and their husband. They could be free human beings. Completely utopian idea. As I mentioned, in law, it wasn't even struck down in the United States until a few years ago. So that was a utopian idea. The idea that young children didn't have to starve. Yeah, that's utopian right now. But I think it's good that people have these utopian ideas. Otherwise, we would be living in a hell of indescribable horror.
many rulers, leaders, and presidents all around the countries are full of corruption, injustice, oppression, greediness. So what if we can guarantee certain leaders which are full of wisdom, virtues, ethics, and helping poor people and trying to implement justice? So guaranteeing such people on the top of the systems, would it help the society more?
I think that's the wrong way to look. We're not going to find a leader who will lead us to heaven. All of the achievements in history, everything that we've described, overcoming chattel slavery, rights of women, you name it. It's come from below, from popular struggle. I mentioned the origin of abolitionism. Black slaves in Africa, Portuguese Africa, became somehow educated enough to organize, appealed to the Vatican, got some response, not enough. Major slave uprisings and revolts, great struggles over centuries, finally achieved something, along with support from popular groups in the European societies who recognize that this is an evil that cannot be tolerated. No great leader brought it about. Same with everything else. You want to wait for a great leader, you wait forever. You want to organize people to struggle for their rights, become informed, get together, develop more just social forms for themselves, overcome authoritarian structures, then you can have progress.
Interesting. So, Professor, if we talk about the positive sides of capitalism, it includes all people. It contains them. So, freedom of speech, development of knowledge. Me and you are talking, you are publishing your books and giving all your lectures and sharing all your knowledge through the modes of technology, which are roots of capitalism.
I mean, you can say that everything that's happened in capitalism is a fruit of capitalism. Everything that happened during the feudal era is a fruit of feudalism. That's tautology. But what actually led to the publishing of books and the sharing of thoughts, the engagement of people struggling to expand understanding, knowledge, information, often against the power systems that ruled the world, and indeed using the technology that developed. So the printing press, for example, in 17th century England, the printing press was permitting poor people, people without much education, bare literacy, to publish pamphlets, to have itinerant workers and preachers traveling around the country, working to demand an end to feudal practices, demanding things like healthcare, education, welfare. There was a major force in England in the 17th century which laid the basis for the first modern democratic revolutions. Very partial democracy at the time, but something. Same was true in later years. Take United States in the 19th century, industrial capitalism just developing. Well, the availability of the printing press allowed working people, often with no education, young women from the farms driven into the textile mills, allowed them to publish their own press, lively press, calling for an end to wage labor, which they saw as only an old form of slavery, free societies, human rights. Okay, that's how the printing press was used. You can call it a fruit of capitalism if you want, but it was technology that was developed and used by people in the best way they could, just like it's a fruit of capitalism that you and I are now using to condemn capitalism. Well, Iran overthrew the Shah. The Shah was, of course, installed by U.S. imperialism, overthrew the parliamentary regime in 1953, took control of Iran's energy resources, imposed a harsh tyranny, was overthrown in 1979. Before it could do anything, almost, Iraq invaded. 1980, Iraq launched an invasion of Iran, a brutal, murderous invasion. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons, killing hundreds of thousands of Iranians. The United States entered right away in support of Saddam Hussein, who was their great friend at the time, provided arms, provided diplomatic support, right through Saddam's worst atrocities, chemical weapons in Iran, poisoning his own population with poisonous chemicals, the Halabja massacre, strong support from the United States. Finally, the United States entered the war directly, protecting Iraqi shipping in the Gulf, got to the point where a U.S. Destroyer shot down a commercial Iranian airliner, killing 290 people. The ship came back to port, was given a laudatory welcome by the president, honored for their achievement. At that point, Khomeini, who was then pretty much running Iran, realized they can't fight the United States and basically capitulated. The United States immediately imposed harsh sanctions, plenty of awful things happening internally, but the situation was so awful. I mean, if you look back over the history, the United States has been torturing Iran since 1953. Before that, Britain was torturing Iran for a century. So you ask what's happening in Iran? A lot of terrible things, but there's a pretty terrible history you have to look at as well. In more recent times, in 2017, arrangement was reached, the joint agreement on nuclear weapons. Iran agreed to pretty much abandon its sovereign right to develop nuclear energy, abandoned it, no more. There were intense inspections which verified that Iran was completely living up to the terms of the agreement. The United States intervened. President Trump abrogated the agreements, imposed very harsh sanctions on Iran. Europe strongly opposed the sanctions, but has to obey them. U.S. sanctions are third-party sanctions. Other countries have to obey them, or else they're severely punished. They can be thrown out of the international financial system, which the U.S. runs. So Europe obeys them, though they oppose them. American corporations oppose the sanctions, but obey them. For Iran, it's devastating the economy. The Guardian Council has its own brutality and repression. Iranian people are caught in a vice. It's very hard to answer the question. Well, let's go on to the next one, Hezbollah. Where did Hezbollah come from? Well, 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. No pretext, no credible pretext. The goal was to drive the Palestinian Liberation Organization out of Lebanon so that Israel could continue its illegal criminal conquest of and settlement of the occupied territories in violation of international law, Security Council resolutions. They killed about 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, devastated southern Lebanon, all with strong U.S. support. Finally, in August 1982, there was so much international pressure with the Israeli bombing of Beirut that the United States had to call Israel off. Said, it's enough, can't do anymore, it's embarrassing to us. Well, they left. Then came the Israeli invasion of West Beirut, Sabra Shatila massacre while Israeli troops were supervising it, Christian Lebanese militias killing probably thousands of people. That was too much. Israel finally pretty much withdrew, but they left a regime in the south, a client regime, South Lebanon Army, which Israel controlled, and was carrying out harsh repression of the local population. In response to that, a guerrilla movement developed, Hezbollah, representing the Shia population, which is the plurality, largest population. They finally succeeded in driving Israel out in the year 2000. They became a bitter enemy of the United States and Israel because you're not allowed to drive out a murderous occupying force that we support. Well, then goes on from there. That's the origin of Hezbollah.
You mentioned information about the oppression and sanctions of the US against Iran. So what's your opinion about Khomeini as a political leader and as a person who fought against the West and capitalism? How do you consider his phenomenon? And is he considered a great political leader in the modern political history, as some claim?
He's obviously a significant figure who had a tremendous impact, but I wouldn't call him a great political leader. I think he's driven Iran into there was an opportunity for Iran to have a democratic revolution. He crushed it, turned it into a state governed by himself, but in general by a guardian council of religious extremists. I don't think that's a proper state for any country, certainly not Iran. And the opportunity, there were very great difficulties that he faced, like the US-backed Iraqi invasion, which was murderous and destructive, the harsh sanctions, plenty of awful conditions that he had to face, but turning Iran into a clerical dictatorship is not my not what I would call being a great political leader. And he didn't have anything to do with capitalism. Capitalism reigns in Iran. Lebanon did succeed. Hezbollah succeeded, in fact, in forcing the Israeli illegal occupation to withdraw. After that come many problems, some external, some internal. Doesn't show that peaceful ways don't lead to any result. Tells you nothing about that. There are special, difficult problems in Lebanon, a lot of them internal, a lot of them external. Violence is not going to solve them. It was driven out by armed resistance. Arab states were doing very little. As long as the US backed the Israeli occupation, it was going to remain. Hezbollah did succeed in making the occupation too costly for Israelis, which is fine. Armed resistance is a gift to the Israelis. if you want to carry out a struggle, you don't move to the terrain where your enemy has all the power and you have none. So Israel loves the armed resistance, gives them a justification for more brutal and vicious actions. The only hope for Palestinians or anyone facing similar conditions is to work through peaceful means that are available to try, crucially, to change U.S. policy, which can be done. That's critical. As long as the U.S. supports the Israeli occupation, nothing's going to end it. Certainly not armed resistance, which just extends the power of the occupiers. But efforts to change U.S. policy can succeed. There are, in fact, initiatives being developed. They are undermined by armed attacks, but they are assisted by peaceful means. For example, there is now, for the first time, serious congressional legislation, which is unthinkable not many years ago, legislation to ban U.S. military and economic aid to Israel, which actually is in violation of U.S. law. Well, those are things that could be pressed forward. They're not helped by armed attacks. Does Israel have the right to exist and continue their settlements? First, no state has a right to exist. None. There is no such thing in international law or any moral code about the absolute right of a state to exist. In fact, that it certainly has no right to continue the settlements, which are in gross violation of international law and Security Council resolutions, can continue only because the U.S. supports them. As a state, Israel is getting weaker in some ways, stronger in other ways, but the concept of right to exist is an interesting one. Nobody ever talked about it until the mid-1970s. In the 1970s, the UN Security Council debated a resolution calling for the right of Israel to exist in peace and security within recognized borders alongside of a Palestinian state, which also had the right to exist within its borders. Israel was strongly opposed to that. The United States vetoed the resolution. At that point, you start hearing talk about right to exist, not right to exist within recognized borders. Well, that's propaganda ploy. Of course, nobody has a right to exist. No state does, that is. When you have your jackboot on somebody's neck, they can cause a threat to you. The way to eliminate the threat is to remove the jackboot. Israel has created Hezbollah. If Israel hadn't carried out the brutal and illegal, long 20-year occupation of South Lebanon, there wouldn't have been any Hezbollah. Iran doesn't pose a threat to Israel. It's Israel that is attacking Iran. Israel that's carrying out sabotage, assassinations, threat of bombing. Iran's not doing that. Potentially, Iran could be a threat. The way to deal with it is by accommodation, not by military attack, sabotage, and assassination. Palestinians to say that it's kind of like saying that in occupied Europe under the Nazis, the population was posing a threat to the Nazis. Yeah, they were. If you run a brutal occupation, you'll create threats. How do you analyze the increased promotion of, there is no promotion of homosexuality. There is acceptance of the right of homosexuality. Those are rights that have been understood back to classical antiquity. Classical Greece, for example, was just taken for granted. Yes, people have that right. There are efforts to deny that right, often on grounds of religious authoritarianism, but to accept the right of people to choose their way of life is not to promote it. Well, I also criticize pornography. You can't block it by law. You have to change. The only way it'll decline is by changing cultural attitudes, understanding, satisfying whatever needs it appeals to in a constructive manner. These are questions of education, tolerance, respect and sympathy for others, even if you disapprove of the way they're acting. Will Muslims have a role in shaping global culture? Depends how they behave. They can. They have in many ways, sometimes in very constructive ways, but that's the opportunity they have in a climate of repression and hostility, which goes back over 1,000 years. You're not going to eradicate it quickly. For 1,000 years, there's been a war by the North, including Russia, against the mostly Muslim South. There's a very good study of this by a fine U.S. scholar, leading Arabist, William Polk, died recently, but it's certainly been happening, and the effort to overcome this should be a joint effort on the part of all of those who are opposed to repression and interethnic hostility and are seeking accommodation and mutual understanding and mutual support. So that's a task for everyone. I traveled to Gaza for two reasons. First, because I was very eager to go, and it happened to be in between two of the major Israeli attacks. So there was a short period in which it was possible to enter through Egypt. The immediate motive was an invitation by the Islamic University for an international conference of linguists. I was asked to participate and, of course, was glad to do so. So there was an immediate issue, the international conference with linguists who were interested from all over the world, including an Israeli friend. But the broader goal was just to have a chance to visit Gaza, one of the most brutally repressed regions of the world. Wanted to see it firsthand. I have friends there who I visited, people I've known for years through correspondence, other meetings. So that was a personal aspect, but mainly to get a firsthand picture of what life was like in this disgraceful prison. Well, artificial intelligence, we have to distinguish what it is from the claims about it, which are quite different. But keeping just to what it is, it has possible utility, although that's not very obvious, and definite capacity to cause serious crime. As you know, thousands of practitioners and enthusiasts for artificial intelligence have recently signed petitions calling for a moratorium on its development and regulation of it because of the great harm it can cause. I didn't sign those petitions because I think they significantly overstated what the achievements are and are therefore misleading. But they can understand very easily why there's concern about the harm, the immediate harm. Now, there's all kind of science fiction fantasies, but the immediate harm is quite real. It's a wonderful technique for defamation, for disinformation, for preying on the gullibility of people who tend to believe these things are real, ask them personal questions, follow advice. All of that can be extremely dangerous. The defamation is very easy with contemporary techniques to construct an image of you and an artificial voice which mimics your voice, saying some outrageous thing. How are you going to stop that? No, has to do with something very simple and personal. I don't know if you want to know the reason, but has to do with my taking blood thinners. Don't want to take a chance of cuts because they can't be stopped. Well, by and large, Oman has played a pretty constructive role in the region by keeping away from the conflicts and oppression and violence and trying to move to expedite negotiations, political settlement, accommodation. That's, I think, been a major contribution of Omani international politics. I don't want to claim to be any kind of an expert in this. I don't know the details of what goes on in Oman and what it's doing, but from what I can read and see, that seems to be a general phenomenon, which has been quite positive. Thank you very much. Good to talk to you as always.
Thank you very much. All the best.